Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me for this session. I hope I can get the technology mastered. It gives me great pleasure to be here today, especially among all of you who are interested in Africa. The last 2 or 3 days we spent in Tokyo, where there was a gathering of the T20, which is the research arm of the G20. And we were presenting a couple of papers on Africa's development. As you know, the G20 meeting is going to take place early next month under the Japanese presidency. In my personal capacity, I've been very closely associated with the G20, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, as the Sherpa for the African Development Bank. And we can talk a bit about that going forward. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about Africa's economic development. There is a report called the Africa Economic Outlook, which some of you have, and those of you who don't have it will be able to access it through the African Development Bank's website. All right, I've got the technology right. So essentially, if you look at Africa's growth prospects, and I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 specific aspects about what's happening on the continent, but let me start with growth. If you put aside what's happening in China and in India, where the rates of growth are actually quite high, if you look at the rest of the developing world, which is the lower graph, Africa's growth, on average, has tended to be higher, right, in the developing world. But it's actually wrong to be talking about averages. It's wrong because sometimes there's a tendency to talk about Africa as if it is one country, and it is not. Africa is a very large continent, a very diverse continent, where every country has its own unique characteristics and performs differently. So if you step back and you look at the continent, in terms of growth, East Africa tends to lead the way. The rates of economic growth in East Africa have been higher, as you will see, approximately 5.7%, followed by the North, and then again followed by the West, the center, and in fact Southern Africa, which has some of the more advanced economies on the continent, has actually not been growing that well and has actually been drawing down the averages for the continent. But look at some of the countries' individual performances, and I've just put up a few. You will see lots of countries across the continent who are actually growing at rates which are higher than 5, 6, 7, 8% a year. Economies like Ethiopia, for example, have approximated double-digit growth for a very, very long time. So there's a lot of diversity across the continent. There are many reasons for this. There are many reasons for the growth that is beginning to take place. And I think a very important reason is that if you look at aggregate demand, more and more of aggregate demand is being driven by investment. So you see increases in the rate of investment that are taking place. The second thing that one sees is that macroeconomic management on the continent has improved. And so previously, when you used to see fiscal deficits in excess of about 7%, you now, on average, see them below 5%, which means that inflation rates, etc., have all started coming down, and this has resulted in improved economic growth. And finally, despite the volatility, there is some pickup again in commodity prices, which are quite important to the continent. So looking at 2020, 2021, we expect growth to pick up slightly more than this year, than 2019, and we expect rates of growth of about 4%, 4.1% on average. But please keep in mind what I said, averages can be very distorting because there are many, many countries growing much, much faster than that. That is not to say that there are not risks, and I want to point out 3 external risks and 3 domestic risks. First, on the external side, a lot of countries across the continent have tended to borrow to finance development. And so there is a risk that as interest rates normalize, this could have an impact on external debt. And I will talk about debt in just a few minutes. But so the normalization of interest rates is something to keep in mind. The second, you hear a lot about in the news these days, which is the trade tension between the US and China. And clearly, when two of the largest economies are having difficulties in trade, and these are important trading partners for the continent, it will have spillover effects on the continent. So that's a second thing I think you need to keep in mind. The third one is something that Africa is very familiar with, which is the volatility of commodity prices. When commodity prices are high, the continent does very well. When commodities prices go down, there is a shock. And so there's a lot of push across the continent to try and diversify the economies and to make them less reliant on single commodities. On the internal side, I will come to this in a minute. It's the vulnerability to debt distress. We are beginning to see more and more countries borrowing to finance their development. And if invested properly, this is a good thing. But if not invested properly, it can become a problem. So I'll talk about that. The second, concerns about security, concerns about terrorism in some parts of the continent. And thirdly, some uncertainties associated with elections, political transition, and so forth. Although, as you've seen, most of the elections taking place now are taking place peacefully. And what is important now is the new governments that are elected into office bring with them economic teams which are able to transform the continent in order to fulfill the aspirations of a very, very young population. And we will talk about that as well. So let me just talk about 3 or 4 main issues that I think are central to African development right now. There's a lot of talk about Africa's debt situation. So the chart over there shows that over the last 7-8 years, aggregate levels of debt expressed as a percentage of GDP are going up. They're not as high as was the case in the 1990s, etc. Some of you might have been familiar when the continent went through debt forgiveness, the HIPC initiative, and so forth. But this is something to keep an eye on, okay? Because there's a lot of concern that if left unchecked, the problems could reemerge. But what is very important in thinking about debt is, again, don't put Africa in one basket. There is a lot of divergence across the continent. There are some countries where the debt to GDP ratios are actually much lower. There are some countries where the debt to GDP ratios in the middle are, in the proper range. And then there are some which are clearly exceeding what would be sustainable. Okay? So the averages tend to mask these individual country differences, and you need to keep an eye out for that. But an important aspect of the debt story is that the type of debt that Africa is contracting is very different. So on the left-hand side, you see a big increase in domestic debt. So countries are borrowing much more from their own domestic markets than was the case in the past. Actually, if you look at the graph on the right, the external debt, by and large, has not grown very rapidly. Okay? Domestic debt has gone up. So the amount of money that Africa owes its own citizens is going up very rapidly. Now, what that means is that when governments borrow from their own domestic markets, there is not enough capital that's left over for the private sector to borrow. So there may be some crowding out that's beginning to take place. The other very interesting thing to notice is, compared to the early 1990s or so, the amount of concessional debt made by organizations like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, by the bilateral donors, has gone down very significantly. And so what's tended to happen is, in order to finance development, many countries are borrowing from the bond markets. And that's much more expensive borrowing. So just to give you an idea, in 2006, the total amount of bonds issued by Africa were about $200 million, right? 2018, it is 30 times bigger, in excess of $6 billion, right? So obviously these are more expensive, and so the cost of servicing the debt has become much more. So it's very, very important, and I will talk about that as Africa thinks about how to finance future development, it looks increasingly towards domestic revenues as opposed to external debt. The second area I want to talk about is the jobs challenge. So every year, roughly about 10 to 12 million young Africans enter the workforce. But the African economies are only able to produce about 3 million productive jobs. These 3 million are jobs that I consider to be decent paying, sustainable employment. So what that means is that about 7 to 8 million young Africans are every year forced to either look for jobs or be underemployed, right? And this is a huge challenge that the political leadership today is focusing on. How do you create jobs across the continent? In the figure on the right, I will show you that despite the growth that's taking place, this growth has not been sufficient to create the kind of jobs. And the type of growth is very important. As you can see from the red line, if growth takes place because of sectors which are labor intensive, you can afford to grow at a lower rate, okay? But if growth is of the kind which does not generate employment, then you actually need to grow at that blue line, about 7%, if you're going to absorb these 10 million people every year, right? The graph at the bottom actually shows the real actual rates of economic growth. So although 4% is a decent rate of growth, it is insufficient to generate the kinds of jobs. So every year, although you keep growing at 4, 5, 6%, you will still not create the jobs you need. So this is a real challenge, and a lot of us are thinking, how do we help the continent create these jobs? Because without that, you could have a lot of social and civil unrest. A key challenge that prevents job creation is the informal nature of African markets. Compared to the rest of the world, the informal sector dominates African GDP to the extent of about 70% or so. And a large part of the population are absorbed by the informal sector. In particular, take a look at the agricultural sector, which as a percent of GDP is not very big, but as an employer is huge. 70% of employment is in the agricultural sector. And a lot of it is not very well paid employment. So that's the real challenge. The business climate also acts as a constraint to job creation. This was a study that was done by the World Bank, which tries and estimates how many jobs are lost every year because of certain constraints. So for example, right, delays in issuing permits causes about 260,000 jobs to be lost every year. Operations of the courts and so forth, the list goes on. And that is why there is so much emphasis in trying to improve the business climate, because once you aggregate these, that's about 2.5 million jobs a year lost. We estimate that if you were able to deal with these, you could create an additional 2.5 million jobs, right? The third issue that I want to talk about, and several speakers have mentioned today, this whole issue of regional integration. There's a tendency for people to talk about Africa as one economy, but the fact of the matter is it's 54 very, very distinct economies, many of which are quite small. In fact, if you aggregate the GDP of all the economies, you're roughly looking at the size of France, the economy of France. And that is why regional integration is so important, and the free trade zone, the free trade agreement that is coming into operation soon is such a priority. Right now, before this continental free trade agreement, there are a multiplicity of regional trading blocs that exist across the continent. Each of them have their own rules, regulations, customs unions, and so forth. And it makes for a very complex trading environment. With the AfCFTA that comes into effect, we think what will happen is approximately $35 billion worth of additional business will become possible. In terms of imports alone, we estimate that, I think, let me go to the next slide, approximately $10 billion worth of imports will be reduced. You know, despite having all the land that Africa has, despite having the water resources, the climate, Africa spends about $100 billion a year of food imports. So rather than actually exporting food, it is a net importer of food to the extent of about $50 billion. We think that the free trade zone and the free trade agreement will allow for a reduction in those imports. And there are some numbers there about to what extent agriculture and manufacturing will be boosted as a result of this. So then there are some policy implications. I think, since my time is approaching, I don't want to spend a lot of time. You've got the handout. There is nothing new about these. It's important to get the basics right. Make sure you have the right institutions. You invest in skills development. You invest in creating well-functioning institutions. Because of your small economies, you help create exports. And I've listed out some of these policy recommendations that the Africa Economic Outlook talks about. I'm going to skip this, and I'm just going to talk about domestic resource mobilization, because I think this is very, very important for the continent. The more the continent can bring its private sector into the folds of the tax net, the more it can transform the informal sector into the formal sector, the more it can strengthen tax administration. I think it can really increase domestic resources. Two things I really want to talk about very quickly. One is the Africa Investment Forum. So, there's a lot of talk about how do we get the private sector to invest in Africa. There are lots of good projects, but a lot of these projects don't get investors. So starting last year, what the African Development Bank decided to do was become a bit more hands-on in encouraging private investment. Throughout the year, we looked at the large list of projects that are available for financing, and we picked 63 projects, where we said what we will do is we will bring these 63 projects into a conference center like this, and we will invite investors to come in, and we will sit down with governments and with investors and say, how do we make this possible? These were worth, as you will see, approximately $47 billion worth. And at the end of the Africa Investment Forum, which was concluded in November in Johannesburg, we were able to sign deals worth approximately $38 billion, covering roughly, I think, 40-something deals, right? We have been very encouraged by this, and what we are planning to do going forward is every year to repeat this, so that every year we are able to bring together 50, 60 really large deals all across the continent, put the ministers of finance, the ministers of trade, the ministers of commerce, in some cases the heads of state. We had 7 or 8 heads of state who attended this, together in the same room with pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and other promoters, and ask them the question, how do we make sure that this project can get financed? What are the constraints? How can we ease the constraints? And this is a model that's proving to be quite successful. A second initiative that I want to talk very quickly about, and it was mentioned earlier, is the Compact with Africa. This is a G20 initiative. It was started under the German presidency about 3 years ago. So far, 12 countries are participants in the Compact with Africa, and the deal is very simple. Essentially, there are 3 areas which businesses have told us are very important to them: the macro environment, the business environment, and the financial environment. And so what the G20 have said to countries is, tell us what you're planning to do in these areas. Help improve the climate in these 3 areas, and what we will do in return is encourage G20 investors to come and invest in your country. 3 years later, this is proving to be a very good experience. I don't have time to go into it, but in your handouts you will see each of the countries has been improving their doing business indicators. Each of them has done better than the non-compact countries. And as a result of that, investment in these countries has really gone up. And there is some data in your handouts. Their rates of growth are higher than other parts of Africa. And in fact, at the Africa Investment Forum, of the $38 billion, these 12 countries attracted $18 billion worth of investment, right? So it shows that there is a close relationship between good policies and the investment that's taking place. Last slide. So in summary, I think one of the messages we are trying to send out to everyone is that if you look in the future, if you're serious about business, if you're serious about development, here's a continent which has the largest or among the largest growing middle class in the world, about 300 to 400 million people. Right now, this middle class generates about $2 trillion worth of business. By 2025 or by 2030, it'll be $2.5 trillion. Business-to-business deals will be about $3.5 trillion. And just so given the orders of magnitude you're talking about, this is a continent that cannot be ignored. And I just put the last sort of cover of The Economist over there, which came out a few weeks ago. I mean, The Economist keeps having these covers of Africa. So this is the latest cover, which says there's a mad scramble for Africa taking place. But I think this time around, there's a real difference compared to what happened in the past. So thanks very much. I look forward to questions from you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapil.